We're going to be looking at the nature of warfare between 1700 and 1900. So when we're talking about the nature of warfare, we're looking at weapons, army composition. This is quite straightforward because between 1700 and 1850 there is not a lot of change here. And we'll be identifying various things to talk about, such as muskets continuing to be used, bayonets, which are basically swords fixed to muskets, artillery, location still being important, tactics still being similar, and the composition of armies being similar too. So not much change here before 1850. We'll start with the weapon that was used, the most common weapon, which is still a musket. This is a Brown Bess musket, and it's used by most infantrymen really from the 1720s to the 1840s. And it was muzzle loaded as usual, a flintlock firing mechanism which had started coming into really being back in the 17th century, 1610s onwards. Capable of 2 to 3 shots a minute, pretty inaccurate, so you have to use in formation, you have to fire as volleys, which is why infantry lines and infantry squares are often used, which again is more continuity from the previous period. Sometimes they misfired. They fired solid round lead balls, and therefore not much change there. Of course, swords were still being used by cavalrymen at this point, but you get the bayonet being used, which is just fixed to the end of the Brown Bess musket and was useful for close combat. Artillery is being used a little bit more on the battlefield. Obviously, you've seen it at Waterloo in 1815 because you saw both sides using it, but particularly the opening of the battle with Napoleon firing at the British forces with artillery. We'll look at artillery a little bit more later. It is becoming lighter, a little bit more mobile, a little bit more accurate, but very, very gradually before 1850. As far as location of battles is concerned, you're still getting, as you saw at Waterloo, the idea, really, which you had at Falkirk and you had back at Agincourt too, the idea that a location at battle was particularly important in resulting success or not. You saw it at Waterloo with Wellington's defensive formations, the use of the ridge, the use of the buildings at Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte too. That still remained pretty important in battles at this time, so there is some continuity there from the Middle Ages even. In terms of tactics, you're still seeing cavalry being used, but a more fluid version where cavalry are perhaps being used in battle in a little bit more of a flowing move, in repeated exchanges. Infantry are still using squares and rows because of the weaknesses of the Brown Bess musket. We talked about the idea they were inaccurate and therefore you needed that incessant volleys of fire, that relentless fire. So tactics were really falling back on ones that had been used for a couple of centuries before. Composition of the army, still really cavalry and infantry, mostly infantry, about 80% really at this time. Cavalry, as we've said, used in a little bit more of a fluid, a more reluctant way. Wellington himself, very reluctant really to use cavalry on a battlefield as artillery and weapons technology improved. So, you know, as we head towards 1850, very little change. Waterloo is your example there. Lots of continuity during this period. Now, you've already probably been told in lessons that the Crimean War is often seen as the first modern war because you are starting to see some new technologies being used. So really the 1850s, the Crimean War is seen as a turning point for weaponry more than anything during this period. But there are other things changing as well as the weaponry. For example, the transport of men and supplies to faraway places. They were using technology sort of steamships and railways too to be able to do that now. And you've probably also done a little bit of work on the developments in communications during this period. You get the invention of the electric telegraph in the 1830s, which sends electrical signals along a cable, for example, Morse code. But it didn't really have much impact on communications on the battlefield just yet, as spectacularly shown at Charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava. There is still a reliance on gesture, written messages, flags, bugle calls, etc. Charge of the Light Brigade is a great example of the problems that still exist with communication at this time. It's weapons where there's a fair bit of change after 1850. The first thing to point out on the list there is the use of the Enfield rifle, which comes in really round about sort of 1850. Rifles are get their name from the grooving on the inside of the gun barrel, the rifling or the grooving, which causes bullets to spin, and therefore they travel straighter, and you increase range and accuracy. So they're just a better weapon in terms of accuracy than the Brown Bess musket, so therefore replace them really about 1850. You can manage 3 or 4 shots per minute, so a slightly better rate of fire than you got with a Brown Bess musket. Rifles use a bit of technology as well in terms of they're using a new percussion cap firing mechanism, which is replacing the old flintlock firing mechanism. And the percussion cap is invented in the 1820s. More reliable guns, even when it's wet. Rifles are still muzzle loaded though at this point in time, so there is still an issue with time for reloading. Cavalrymen still carried pistols at this time, though they continued really to use swords on the battlefield. Pistols still weren't particularly great, very short range, limited accuracy. And in terms of artillery, artillery continued to be smooth bore artillery. In other words, the technology did not yet exist to create rifling in larger guns. However, this changed in the 1860s. And from the 1860s, artillery pieces began to be cast out of solid steel. There were new manufacturing methods that enabled this to happen, and large pieces of steel were cast relatively cheaply. Now, cast steel guns were much stronger, and they were more capable of being rifled than previous cast iron pieces. You also get, because of the Industrial Revolution, industrialists cheaply mass producing large pieces of steel really from this period in the 1850s. So you get rifling in artillery from the 1860s. Indeed, the biggest artillery, by the time you get to about 1900, could achieve ranges of 10 kilometres. So you can see how industrialisation and the impact of the Industrial Revolution and mass production and new technologies and new methods did start making a difference to warfare after 1850, particularly artillery in the 1860s. As well as that, also, we have brass ammunition cartridges being used during this period. Brass cartridges were quicker, less dangerous to reload, and started to enable effective loading at the breech. So you are starting to see the innovation now of guns that could be loaded at the breech, above the trigger, not the muzzle, which of course reduced reload time considerably, thereby increasing the rate of fire. These brass cartridges contained 1 bullet and gunpowder inside a brass case. This had not been possible before. Shot and powder, remember, had to be loaded separately in the past and pushed down the muzzle with a ramrod. Other changes during the period after 1850. By the time you get to the 1880s, there is smokeless powder which is emitted from guns when they're fired, and this massively improved visibility on the battlefield. We've also talked about already the development of mass production from 1850 and the increasing use of factories, which meant that a lot more weapons could be produced and could be produced more quickly. So therefore, we're seeing a period where weapons and ammunition are beginning to be available in much larger quantities than ever before. As well as this, there are increasing tensions in European relations from the 1870s. Most of this is caused by the growing perceived threat of Prussia, and then, following unification, German military strength, and growing imperial rivalries around the globe, of course. This will all lead to the First World War. And as a result, governments did increase their military spending, and you have the development of an arms race developing in the later years of the 19th century. So, technology, industrialisation, starting to impact now, artillery playing a bigger part now as their barrels can be rifled with the new casting of steel, cartridges, smokeless powder, governments getting involved in increasing military spending. All these things are happening from 1850, which is your turning point during this period really here in the nature of warfare. And of course, you can see where all this is going. It's eventually going to result in the mass slaughter that we see in 20th century wars, for example, the First World War in 1914.